Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion will be part 24 in our ongoing series on operating system deployment in Configuration Manager. Current branch, this installment will focus on the new task sequence debugger available in 1906. Specifically, our agenda, very similar to what we've done in all of our sessions. What is the task sequence debugger? Why do we care? Want to focus on the task sequence debugger in terms of requirements, supporting configuration scenarios, the real meat of the discussion, letting you see this in action. We'll wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks. Okay, so let's just jump into this. What is the task sequence debugger? What is task sequence debugging? Well, it is debugging, right? Frankly, if if you've ever used any kind of debugger with any kind of programming language or whatever, the concepts that are present in those debuggers are also present in task sequence, in the task sequence debugger. So I've said for as long as I can remember, I've referred to the task sequence engine as really a kind of a mini programming environment. It's not in that you don't need to know code and so forth, but it is in terms of the logical flow of how things operate in the task sequence engine. So it makes perfect sense to align a traditional debugging type approach to the task sequence engine, and that's certainly true. So if you've ever worked with another debugger anywhere, this will look familiar to you as you see it, right? So task sequence debugging is debugging applied to a task sequence. So why do we care? Right? Well, for a lot of reasons. Mainly among them is to really help you optimize building and troubleshooting your task sequence. If you've ever built and tested task sequences, you know that Murphy's Law plays a big role. You know, most of the time, seems like anyway, the problems that you'll have in a task sequence are way at the bottom of the task sequence or in an inconvenient place or insert your own scenario here where it's kind of challenging to get the task sequence fully vetted, fully production ready, and then once you release it's an amazing process. The whole use of task sequencing for imaging, for non-imaging kind of approaches, but you do have to spend a lot of time up front to make sure that your task sequence is ready to go, right? If you've done that, you know that this debugger is sorely needed and will be a huge help to you, even having maybe not seen it yet, because we haven't gotten to that part of this session yet. Being able to see the task sequence run, right? Watching the task sequence flow. So, in various forums, in various sessions, I've talked about the way the task sequence is logical, the way it returns one section to another in the task sequence and hands things off back and forth. The task sequence debugger will help you visualize that. It may not be exactly the way perfect visualization, but it's certainly better than anything we have now. We'll see some of that as we go through. Being able to control the task sequence flow. So if you have a problem in the task sequence, you have the ability to skip the steps that you want to and jump right to that section. Now there's some nuances about that, right? I'll mention them here. I'll probably mention them again. If you have a step that is down in the middle of your task sequence that depends on previous steps having executed, then once you get to that, if you jump right to that middle step, you're probably going to see a failure or something that is not what you expect, and it may be not at all because the task sequence is a problem, but more because you didn't let the task sequence steps run ahead of time that needed to run in order to configure something in the environment like a task sequence variable or something. But you do have the ability to control exactly where you jump in the task sequence. Okay, in terms of requirements, there are a few. This is a Config Manager 1906 feature, right? So you do need at least Config Manager 1906. You need Config Manager 1906 on both the server and the client, and you need to make sure you have updated boot images so that the client components inside those boot images will also be 1906, right? Because again, we fully support bare metal and so on, as you'll see. Updated ADK, just to make sure that you're up to date on the ADK. Always a good idea. Debugging enabled. So there's a couple of ways to actually go about enabling debugging in a task sequence. The first is to do a debug deployment. That's how I've done it in the demos that are coming up. The other is just to use task sequence variables. So there are a couple of task sequence variables that you can leverage to switch on debugging, right? So those would be there's a number of places that you can apply task sequence variables, collections, machines. If you put those task sequence variables on either a collection or machine, then debugging will happen when the task sequence runs. But there's other places that you might think about applying these task sequence variables, such as inside the task sequence itself. But that's going to be a problem. I haven't actually tested that scenario as of this recording, but I can imagine that would be a problem because once the task sequence starts, it needs to know to start in a debugging mode. If you wait until you're inside the task sequence to declare the debugging task sequence variables, you're too late, right? There's also the ability to put variables on boot media. I haven't tested that either, but that is injecting the variable before the task sequence starts, so that should work just fine itself. You'll need a debugging collection. So this is specifically a collection that has 10 or fewer resources in it, right? The debugging experience is intended to be on a very small set of test machines. So any collection that has more than 10 is considered to be too big, and we only show you those that have 10 or fewer. Also, uh, it's intended to be run locally, right? So not supported remotely. So just have computers local. That's kind of a no-brainer. You're going to want to debug on machines that you have local. But just to state it, remote debugging is not currently supported. So uh, FYI. Also need to be able to log into your local computer as a local admin. In terms of supported configurations, so nested task sequences, yeah, totally supported. You're going to see that as we go along. Unknown computers, absolutely. Unknown computers are supported as a target type. You would need to add the unknown computer object to your debugging collection in order for the policy to get there when you boot up. But besides that, yeah, they're supported like normal. Now, you may use unknown computers for traditional deployment. You may not need them or want to use them here for task sequence debugging because you are limited to collections with 10 devices, and it's really easy with those 10 devices or whatever to import them into the console, make them known, whatever the case may be. But yeah, absolutely, totally supported, no problem. In terms of scenarios, really anything bare metal, any re-image scenario, no problem. Any imaging task sequence, any task sequencing scenario that you want to set up is perfectly fine, right? As you'll see. So let's get into the fun stuff here, and that is the demo. So the first thing I want to do is show you configuring the debugging experience, and so let me pull in my site server for that. All right, and so to set that up, basically, first thing I need, well, at some point I need here, I'll do it first, is to have a debugging collection. So I've created that here, and it contains two devices. Right? Contains two devices. Has my bare metal machine I'm going to use for testing, and has a full OS machine I'm also going to use for testing. So in terms of setting this up, really, really easy. Need that collection. Also need to go into your OSD node and go down to task sequences and decide what task sequence you want to actually deploy. Right? Now, again, we've talked about being able to uh, flag a task sequence as one that you want to debug. Right? In one sense, you can do it here. This is a debugging demo. This is another one that I'm using for the debugging demo. And so you'll see that both of these have a deployment to the debug collection I just showed you. Both of these do. Now, when you deploy a task sequence, it will show up here. These are not standard task sequence deployments. Let me show you what I mean. So if you right click normally you would say deploy, and you would be ready to go. But if you deploy this task sequence, it is not going to go into debugging. You need to flag the task sequence to be one that's going to snap into debugging by clicking debug, which will take you into a deployment wizard, right? And so here it's going to warn you about a high risk. It's going to show you only collections that have 10 or fewer, and that's all of mine. So I'll just choose one because I'm not planning to make this real, and then go forward. And then it's only going to be available. It's not, you can't run a debug task sequence as mandatory. And here I don't have the option to do anything besides the ConfigMgr client because this is a non-imaging task sequence and it doesn't have a boot image. So by default, we know that it's only going to run in a full OS. If I did have an imaging task sequence, I would have this option, this dialog box where I could select some things, drop down where I could select some things. But then from here, it's all the same, right? All the same stuff that you're accustomed to for a deployment. You finish this up, and that is now your deployment that is flagged for debugging. If you don't do it that way, you can still kick into debug mode, but you would need to use variables as we talked about already, right? So that said, let me show you this working. And so I'm going to pull in a VM now that is booted into PE. It's ready to go, right? So I'm going to hit next. And it's going to find this task sequence, which is flagged for debugging. Click next on it again, and it runs. And the very first thing it does is it pops up the debugger, and it does not go anywhere else. It's waiting for me to tell it what to do. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use some of the options. Well, let's talk about the options that we have first. And then I'm going to use a couple of the options. These windows you can move around however you want. You can resize if you have a long task sequence or whatever as you want to. Move it around. I'll just move this one down a little bit. It's all good, right? Now, let's just talk about it. So we have step. Step is actually going to run the next step in the task sequence. So if I step through, it's going to go one step at a time and run through the task sequence. Now, I'm going to show you that in a minute, okay? Run is going to run the task sequence normally from the current location up until you either get through the task sequence or you hit your next breakpoint, right? So that's here. Now, set current is allowing you to go through and say, yeah, well, I don't want this step to be current. I want to actually start here and set that to be my current step. You notice that where pointer starts down here. So whenever I click run or step or whatever, it just goes from there. Now, I don't want that. I'm going to set this back to the current. But you can do that. That's where you can jump ahead and so forth. Now, again, just call back. If steps are skipped, that set variables or otherwise conditions or other things in the environment that are needed for subsequent steps to run, then you could very well see failures if you skip past those and don't accommodate what's needed in the environment. So just be aware of that. You can get into a bind debugging that shows a failure when it's really not a failure just because you made a mistake, right? So be aware. Being able to set a breakpoint, I can say, hey, I want to run up until here. So it's going to say stop. I just set that. I'm going to clear my breakpoints. I can go down here and say, hey, run until I'm setting up the operating system. I can set a breakpoint there, no problem, right? And it'll run up until that point. Or I can clear all breaks, like I showed you. Clear all breaks will clear all of my breakpoints. I can open up my log file, my SMSTS log, and it's going to take me to the point in which I'm at in my execution. So this, you see, it's not running because it's waiting. It's just sitting at this step, waiting for me to run. I'll pull this over to the side here a little bit, so you'll see it execute a few more lines in the log whenever we go forward. And then finally, you can open up the command prompt here, which will in PE open up your command prompt. So if you want to see that, you can absolutely do that same kind of thing that we could have always done by enabling that option in the boot media, but still it's there. Cancel and quit, kind of self-explanatory. So let me make sure that I'm back up here, right? And watch our log. So it is a little bit crowded on the screen, but watch our log. You're going to see it move. And I'm just going to say step. And notice how we run. So we're going to step into capture files and settings. And notice what happened. I completely skipped every single one of these steps. Why? Because there's a conditional on this group that I don't match anything in that group. So I just bypass it and move on. Right now, I'm going to go on. I'm going to run through this. I'm going to let this run. I'm going to actually set a breakpoint right here. Right, so let's set a breakpoint and wait. Actually, yeah, I'm going to set a breakpoint. I'm going to set a breakpoint right here as well. Let's just see. I'm going to let this thing run up until that breakpoint. So it's going to keep running just like normal. You see the logs are moving forward. So it's partitioning. You're going to see that it's going to skip over this one because this is not a UC partition. So it'll go right down here to applying operating system. And so on. So it just skips, right? It's going to keep on rolling and so on until we get through. So let's pull this off to the side, right? But that is running through in a bare metal scenario, works beautifully. This is in Windows PE. We'll come back in and check on that in just a minute. If I can get it out of the screen, pull it to the side. Right. Now, I want to show you in a full OS. So I have this one. This one is a boring task sequence. It's just 2 steps, but really quickly, I just want to show you that in a full OS, we can do the same exact thing, just initiate the task sequence engine there. And I see, in fact, that I've already got it on the screen. Let me clear that out and end this. Good enough. Okay, good. So here is my in a full OS. Right, that just finished running the task sequence. That's okay. So let's go into Software Center. And so what I want to do is show you a couple of things here. One is that we do have the ability, this is a non-imaging task sequence, 2 steps. I'm just going to rerun it. And so whenever it runs, it's going to do like normal. And when the task sequence starts to run, it's going to immediately kick in the debugger. Again, 2 steps here, not all that exciting of a task sequence, but you see it runs just fine. And we'll run through the steps and be done, and we're finished, right? And so all good. So the debugger goes away. So that's a non-imaging task sequence. I'm not showing you an imaging task sequence here. Same kind of deal would happen, right? And I don't want to re-image this machine, so I don't want to show you that. But the other thing that I want to show you is here is a nested task sequence, right? So I'm going to go ahead and install that. Now, in the nested task sequence video that I did, I talked about that the nested task sequence is really an advantage for the admin to help keep things organized, right? That it's really not a client-side benefit in that when the client receives the task sequence, it's all the policy of the nested task sequence is stitched together to allow the full task sequence to run. And you see this here. So this is on the client, and this is the nested task sequence. And it is a straight line. Let me move some of these things out of the way. A straight line approach to exactly what's going to run, right? All right here. Some of the steps are grayed out, and so on. Right? If you look at the actual task sequence built in the console, so here are my nested task sequence. Here's my nested task sequence demo. So I've got it broken out in all these different ways. I've got my main task sequence. I've got child task sequences off of it. Then I have a child off of a child. So I have a grandchild task sequence. And it's all there. The client doesn't care. It stitches it all together, and you can run it like normal. No problem at all. Now, one thing that I did not talk about that I should is this little window down here. This is a very, very valuable window. Why? Because it will detail for you every task sequence variable that is declared, what its value is, all along the way. Now, I say every task sequence variable. That's really not true. There are some internal task sequence variables that we will not show you here because they're internal and you can't change them anyway, and they're used to kind of drive the process of the task sequence flow. So we will hide those, but all of the ones that are important to you we'll show you. Any that you define we'll show you. So it's awesome to be able to step through the task sequence and be able to see your variables being declared so that you know if things are set the right way. Maybe there's something going wrong in the logic. part of the steps are not running as you think they should. The logic isn't correct there, and so on. But you can step through it. Now, um, used to be that I would discuss using a script inside of your task sequence to dump variables at a different location. In fact, the nested task sequence that you see is dumping variables at specific locations just to prove how things persist and so on. But here, you don't need to do that. You just run the debugger. You can see them all and know exactly what's happening along the way. And it's a really, really, really cool addition. All right. So let me pull this back out of the window over here. Let me pull my machine that I was letting image on the side back in. Have an error message on the screen, but that's okay. I was hoping we would get to the breakpoints, but this will help me illustrate what I want to show you. Anyway, so I have this error, and what I have in the log, let me just scroll up a little bit, pull this up out of the way, is you will see I have where we're saying, hey, this failed, whatever, and then up here, let the parent group decide. So when it's referring to the parent group, it's talking about the installed operating system group, right? And so one of the things that, again, this is very useful to see the flow. The flow isn't depicted in the way that maybe it would be most optimal right now, but it's still very helpful. And here's what I mean. So it's so easy to think that one step happens after another, happens after another, happens after another, even within groups. But what really happens is when we get finished with a group, let's just talk about this. When we get finished with this group, right, we'll process here and process all of these steps, and let's say that we're good, right? Then we will return. You notice I'm not clicking on that. I'll explain why in a minute. We'll return control back up to the group. The group then decides what to do. Oh, sorry. The group then decides what to do, and then we'll continue on, right? So that's the way it flows. Here in this group, we'd start here, go within, go within, go within. Here we go, here we go, here we go, and there. And then once we're done, even fully successful, we'll return control back to this group and then move on down to this group, right? Why? Because we might have conditionals in this group to say, don't come here under certain circumstances. That's how troubleshooting task sequences are engineered. So you don't see the bar. So as the bar is running through, you don't see it move back up here and move back down like I did. Instead, what you see is you see this second instance of install operating system that is grayed out, right? So that's what it's trying to do, is show you that once I'm done with this step, we're going to go back up to install operating system and then go on. So that's the way it's depicted in the debugger. All right. So let's pull that on out of there. Now, moving on and starting to move toward wrapping up the session, right? So troubleshooting tips and tricks. So just wanted to call out a couple of things here. Specifically, first, there really isn't a whole lot to talk about in terms of troubleshooting, because troubleshooting here is not different than troubleshooting in OSD. You have the SMSTS log. You certainly have entry points where you can pull that up. You have some other better ways to correlate some things, perhaps, but you still have the core of it is the SMSTS log, which we've talked about, at length. A few tips and tricks. So again, task sequence variables. So task sequence variables, the window that I showed you absolutely will show the current value for all variables in a task sequence environment. It makes it very, very convenient, especially if you're heavily using task sequence variables or just to see the variables as they're defined, even the system variables, some of them. But again, some task sequence variables are absolutely and totally internal use only, and they will not be listed in that reference documentation. So just be aware of that. In terms of reboots, the debugger absolutely will persist through a reboot, but if you've set breakpoints to happen after a reboot, those breakpoints will be cleared. You will have to reset those. And then, as I showed you, child task sequences fully and totally supported, so use those as you need. And that brings us to the end, right? Wrapping up. I wanted to show you this because it is so very powerful and very helpful. It is currently a pre-release feature. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. So to use it, you will need to have consented to use pre-release features, but it's something that there's no reason at all to not use it right now. It is production ready. It will the fact it is a pre-release feature suggests that it will get additional enhancements over time. The core functionality should remain the same. So we will end the session here and see you next.